Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for joining today. We will give everybody a few moments to join from the waiting room, and then we'll get going. Welcome. Hi to everybody who's joining. I hope everybody's doing well, wherever you're joining from, be it from Brussels or abroad. Thanks so much for tuning in. Just wait a few more moments. Please feel free to grab some water, and we'll start soon. So good morning if it's morning your time, good afternoon if it's the afternoon, good evening. I know some of you are joining from outside the EU. It's a pleasure to have you here with us in this webinar, very interactive webinar on the topic of how we can align the Unfair Trading Practices Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which we'll abbreviate to CSDDD for most of today. We have organized this together with the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, and we are the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, two NGOs who are based in Brussels, and we're delighted to welcome you here today, and we're also very happy about the generous support of the GIZ, the German Cooperation for International Development, and also the generous support of the EU. That being said, all opinions today are our own. We are going to delve for about half an hour into the topics of today, and we'll tell you in a moment who you will be hearing from. But before we do that, you might see a little note saying that this is being recorded or live streamed. This is the case. However, we will only be putting online the presentations part of today and not the discussion. The discussion part will, however, automatically be shared with everybody who registered. We had quite a lot of interested people who were not able to make this timing, and as such, the recording will be shared with those people. However, no discussions will be shared publicly on the internet. That will only be our presentations. We are here today on behalf of the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. That will be myself, Alina Kahle, the Senior Policy and Project Coordinator of the FTAO. And I'm here together with our Managing Director, Jorge Conesa, who you will hear from later today. And we are here with our co-organizing partner, the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, ECCJ, with Dr. Virginie Ruas, who is joining us to share some perspectives on the CSDDD later on. Before we get into the content, though, we'd like to know a bit more who is in the room today. Some of you we know, some of you we don't, and as such, we have made this Slido presentation. If you can scan the QR code, that way you can join the interactive dashboard and tell us a bit more about how familiar you are with the various topics we're discussing today. The first question would be to let us know how familiar you are with the Unfair Trading Practices Directive. This is very interesting. We've got a delightful mix of people. Some of you are experts, some of you have heard about it for the first time. For those of you who've never heard about it, don't worry, we'll go into some basics. For those of you who are very familiar, we've also got some new ideas for you. I'll give it a few more seconds. I'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we've got a majority for not at all first time hearing about it. Thank you for joining. What about the other word that is in our title? The CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. First time, or are you experts? Unsurprisingly, much more people know about this. That is what we expected as well. And we're glad to see a good level of familiarity. But again, if you've never heard about it, don't worry. I think Virginie is an expert who's able to clarify some points as well on the spot, if in need. Great. We've got one more question for you, which is in regards to the intersections of the two directives. We're wondering if you've ever really thought about these two intersections, and we'll ask you to try to summarize it in one word. That word can also be no, if you've never thought about it and this is the first time. I'm glad to see that 2 words are also possible, so. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing some thoughts. Let me see, fairness, incomes, purchasing practices, living income. Great. Let's give it a few more seconds. We see that some of you have already brainstormed, so we look forward to the discussion later on with you. Wonderful. Thank you to everybody. We get a good sense of who is in the room this way and what brings you here today. Now, to let you know a bit about what we're doing, I will start to just very quickly go through how we got here, purchasing practices in EU policy. How have we gotten here? That won't take more than 5 minutes. And then we'll pass over to our managing director, Jorge Conesa, who will give a state of play on the Unfair Trading Practices UTP Directive. And we'll also tell you about the upcoming revision, which is a key advocacy opportunity. And then I'll pass over to Virginie Ruas, who will walk us through the CSDDD, some opportunities to develop synergies here, and the public consultation that is currently open. This will take about 10 minutes, and then we'll head straight into interactive Q&A. You'll see that all of you can actually turn on your camera and unmute if we give you the power to, and that is definitely what we would like to do later on. Now, with regards to how we've gotten here, several of you mentioned purchasing practices as a key topic, and indeed, all the way back in 2013, the European Commission, so the EU's executive, basically, they put out a green paper which listed the problem of unfair trading practices across several sectors. It identified several priority sectors, including agriculture, textiles, and many more, and flagged that this is a key problem to be addressed. And based on having identified that there are some issues, it then actually made a first legislative intervention addressing the topic of UTPs. This was a directive that was then passed in 2019 that Jorge will tell you more about, the UTP Directive. This one, however, targets only agricultural and food supply chains and not necessarily all of the ones that the Commission had identified. Afterwards, a couple of years have passed and no further legislative proposals have come up for all the other sectors that the Commission had identified. And therefore, in 2023, the European Parliament, in a EMI report, an own initiative report on textiles, called for action on purchasing practices in the textile sector and reminded the Commission of the Green Paper, which had flagged that as a priority topic as well. Now, to date, we're still waiting for dedicated UTP directives on these different topics, but we did get in between the CSDDD. In 2024, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was adopted, and it does require companies in scope to address the impact of their purchasing practices as part of their HREDD process. So didn't give any sector-specific rules, but generally incorporated purchasing practices in this directive. Now, as many of you have experienced very firsthand, the revised CSDDD post-Omnibus had quite a few things that were cut, changed, and removed. However, it still retains the clauses on purchasing practices. So that is one thing that was not changed. However, the company scope was further reduced. There were other parts that were diluted. And as such, the directive does not necessarily apply to as many companies as many of us had hoped. But those that are in scope do need to still examine their purchasing practices. This is a very quick zoom through how we've gotten to where we are. And in that, we'll then pass over to Jorge to walk you through in detail the UTP directive and what kind of opportunities there are. Over to you, Jorge.
Thank you, Elena. And I'll start with an apology. There is work going on in the office next door. So if at some point you are having trouble hearing, raise your hand and I'll find an alternative. I hope it's going to be right. So I'll start by explaining what is the logic of the UTP directive, how does it work, and then slowly go more into details about why, from the FTAO perspective, we think that this could be very relevant for anyone working in the due diligence sphere. So if the due diligence directive expects companies to manage the harm, the impact they can have in their supply chain, the logic of the UTP directive is the radical opposite. It's not about a process, it's not about managing your own risk, identifying, evaluating, etc. But it simply bans a number of practices, always the same practices, always the same ban, regardless of what is the exact impact that you are going to have with those practices. This implies that there is less room for nuances, less room to adapt to the particular needs of a given company, but arguably it also means that it can have a more direct it's easier to activate, and we're going to see how it works later. So the logic why this directive exists, to start with that paper that Elena mentioned in 2013 about the imbalances of power in the supply chain and the impact that they had, is that after that initiative, there was a voluntary initiative basically suggesting retailers, suggesting buyers to refrain from imposing certain abusive practices. All of you are going to be very surprised to learn that that voluntary initiative didn't work, and the EU decided that the only way forward was to legislate. The market dynamics of the agri-food supply chain, I'm not going to go too deep into that because I think probably most of you know the basics, but it's the EU agriculture sector is market oriented since the end of the guaranteed prices of the old CIP. There is a lot of producers. Producers tend to be way smaller than their buyers, and there is an important downstream concentration. To give you a number, the top 5 grocery retailers on most of the EU member states hold over 60% of the market, sometimes up to 80% of the market. So these market dynamics mean that there is imbalances of bargaining power, which mean that whatever is agreed upon in the contract doesn't necessarily mean that it's free. A producer is often forced to accept certain terms in the contract that just deviate from good commercial practice. But as a producer, what can you do? You cannot really negotiate your better terms in your contract. This results in the abusive practices that the Commission tries to forbid with this directive, which are not only bad for the farmers, but also end up in harming consumers, even harming some of the retailers who, for one reason or another, do not want to impose those abusive conditions. So that's the key element why the Commission decided to put in place legislation. They realized that this system, these imbalances of power, were having an economic impact on the EU, were having an impact in consumers. And that's why they decided that this was not okay, that in that 2013 study that Elena mentioned, the result was that about 95% of the farmers said that at some point they were suffering some of the UTPs that the directive targets. So obviously that was a legislative intervention was needed. So in this context, the UTP directive targets just the consequence. So it's not intended to change the market dynamics. It's not intended to change the imbalances of bargaining power. Those are still there, but it targets some of the consequences. So even if you are in a dominant position, there are certain things that you're not going to be able, certain illegitimate advantages that you're not going to be able to extract out of that dominant position. Next slide, please. And it does so by defining first a list of what's called black UTPs, those that under no circumstance are allowed. They just cannot be in the contract. If they appear in a contract, oral or written contract, the producer can denounce it to the authorities. And then there's the gray UTPs, those that can appear, but they have to be explicitly agreed upon in the contract. So they cannot be imposed in negotiations that happen after the contract is signed. They cannot be part of an oral contract. It has to be on a written contract. I'm not going to go through all of them because you would finish sooner reading them. But the most noticeable ones and the ones that the producers were complaining more about is late payment. So this somehow is covered also by the late payment regulation, but the way of working of the UTP directive is probably easier to to implement. But then there's other aspects such as commercial retaliation, the misuse of trade secrets, etc., that are also gathering quite a lot of attention because there has been quite a lot of complaints to enforcement authorities about them happening. Next slide, please. So who is protected by the UTP directive? Any supplier. It can be a farmer, but it can be any other actor in the value chain who moves to the next step. So this means that some entities can both be perpetrators of UTPs, but also suffer UTPs, typically a processor. They can be perpetrating a UTP towards a producer, but also suffer a UTP from a retailer. And next slide, please. The second element is that you're protected if you are selling to the EU, no matter if you are an EU citizen or enterprise, or if you're placed out of the EU. If you're selling to the EU, no matter if you're in or out of the EU, you are protected and you can complain. In the case of EU entities, they can choose to complain to either the national enforcement authority of your country. Let's say that I'm a producer in Spain selling to France and a UTP happens. I could complain to the enforcement authority in Spain or the one in France. If you are out of the EU, you would typically complain to the enforcement authority of the member state of your buyer. And the last element is that you are always protected if you're smaller than your buyer. There is a number of threshold. So when you move to the next box in this image, you are always protected. As this is a directive, each member state, and this is a minimum harmonization directive, which means that the legislation in each of the EU member states changes a lot. There is quite a number of member states that have erased this condition. So you are always protected, no matter if you're selling to someone who is bigger than you or smaller than you. And the same happened with other of the conditions. So for example, there's some member states that have decided that some of the gray UTPs will become black. There is quite a variety within the EU. I'm saying here what is the minimum where you're always protected. So if you're smaller than your buyer, you're always protected. Next slide, please. Okay, and before moving to, so you said next slide, but before moving to this, just one last thing to clarify is about like the how do you complain. The process is, and that's what I was mentioning at the beginning, is relatively straightforward. Any supplier can always file an anonymous complaint to the enforcement authority of her member state. And the authorities are supposed to investigate what has happened. There can also be anonymous tips to the enforcement authorities. And what is important is that, in principle, to launch an investigation, you do not even need a lawyer. You just go to the website of the enforcement authority, fill in the information, clarify if you want to remain anonymous or not, and then things move ahead. It doesn't mean that depending on how the investigation goes, where it goes, and in which member state, it could result in a legal dispute, but it's not necessarily the case. And again, in principle, you just have to check what's the enforcement authority, file a complaint, and this can also be done by an interested party who has information about what is going on, and the affected party, the supplier, can also be represented by any interested party. That could be an NGO or a producer's organization. So the process is relatively straightforward. Now I move to the last part of my intervention, which is, well, why you have enough on your plate with all your problems with due diligence and with any other file. Why should you, on top of that, care about all of this? I will start three different, let's say, lines of thought. There can be others, and the interesting thing for me would be to hear your reflections also afterwards. So the first reason why I think that this the review of the UTP directive can be very interesting for the due diligence sphere is that silence, so the fact that you can complain in a relatively straightforward way in the UTP directive doesn't mean that that people do so. Unfortunately, the majority of complaints, 90% of the cases, have been opened by the enforcement authorities of just 4 EU member states. And this doesn't mean that in the rest of the EU member states, there is no UTPs happening. Unfortunately, it's rather the opposite. The UTPs also happen in the rest of the member states, but because of different reasons, because of the enforcement authorities being less transparent, because of a different culture, complaints are not happening as much as they should. So a possible link here would be that because in due diligence, companies are expected to proactively identify the harms, the risks, etc., there can be an expectation of these companies, going the step further and not waiting for complaints for violations of the UTP directive to arrive, but actually checking proactively if that's happening in their own supply chains. Because again, while there has been quite a large number of complaints, it remains minimal compared to the number of transactions that occur. The second line is that, as Elena was saying, there has been demands of the logic of the UTP directive being applied to sectors other than agri-food. That has not happened, and given the context in the Commission now, it's very, very unlikely that there will be a legislative proposal in this direction. But the UTP directive offers us already a ready-made typology of practices that are abusive that we can probably expect that companies out of the agri-food sector already refrain from doing. And the last area is that the UTP directive is now under review. The public consultation has already finalized. There's now stakeholder targeted consultations, and the Commission is expected to come up with a proposal by the end of this year. It could end up by the beginning of the next year. So that opens quite a lot of interesting possibilities. The first one is, and perhaps the one that is gathering more attention, is a potential new UTP banning the purchases below the cost of production. There was already discussion about this being considered a UTP in the beginning of the process in 2019. Finally, the Commission didn't want to go as far as that, and now there are demands. It's going to be an uphill battle, but there is quite a lot of traction in this direction. And another approach could be if this review is an occasion for new UTPs that could offer protection that complements the one that the due diligence directive offers. For example, if there could be new UTPs that offer some level of protection against cut and run or other of the challenges of the diligence. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to hearing the Virginia's presentation and the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Jorge. Virginie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today. Elena, do you mind moving to the next slide, please? Thank you. So today I will just make a few comments about the ongoing consultation on the CSDDD guidelines and highlight the opportunities that it provides for CSOs to advocate for robust guidance on key issues in the agri-food sector. The Commission is legally required to develop guidelines to support the implementation of the CSDDD. And as part of this process, it must consult with stakeholders. So for that purpose, it has launched a public consultation, which is open until Friday, 24th of July, which is basically the end of next week. So the consultation is really designed to gather practical input on the best way to implement the directive. And it includes questions on several key topics for the agri-food sector. So I listed those that I will be covering today, but of course be aware that there are many more topics that are relevant. So the first one is the identification of risk and adverse impacts. The second one is purchasing practices. The third one is living income and living wage. And the fourth one is responsible disengagement. On the PowerPoint, you can see the relevant questions. So in our view, this consultation provides an important opportunity for CSOs to influence the Commission's guidelines and to provide information on best practices and as well as the reality on the ground on those issues that I just mentioned. Could we move to the next slides, please? So I will first give a few comments about risk identification and assessment under the CSDDD. So as Elena has already pointed out, the Omnibus 1 directive has diluted some of the CSDDD provisions, including those on risk identification and assessment, and it has restricted the ability of companies to actually request information from business partners. So there are like a significant limitation on how companies can access information. This is, I mean, there were a few reasons why it was done this way. One of them was to protect SMEs from overly broad and standardized questionnaires, as was seen under the German Supply Chain Act. However, if applied too restrictively, these rules could also undermine effective due diligence because it can prevent basically companies from having access to the information that is needed for them to effectively identify risk. So we see that actually the consultation is an opportunity for CSOs to help shape the Commission's guideline on this very specific topic. And how it can do so is, for example, CSOs can, for example, provide information on how to identify reliable data and information sources for effective risk identification and assessment. We also think that it's very important for the Commission to be aware of practical tools that enables companies to identify risk in agri-food supply chains without placing unnecessary burdens on supply chain. And we also do believe that purchasing practices or information that we can get from there can also be relevant in the context of risk identification and assessment under the CSDDD. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may be less familiar with the CSDDD, I just want to mention that the directive explicitly addresses purchasing practices as part of companies' due diligence obligations. So basically, what does it mean? It means that when companies identify risk or adverse impacts for human rights and the environment, they must take appropriate measures to prevent and seize them. And in relevant context, companies might be required to modify or improve their purchasing practices. So companies are expected to do a few things. For example, they're expected to develop and use purchasing policies that contribute to living wages and incomes for their suppliers. They are also expected to avoid creating harmful commercial pressures that contribute to adverse human rights and environmental impacts. So here, I think that's very interesting. We see a clear interaction or complementarity with the UTP Directive. And what is very important is that actually the CSDDD places a particular emphasis on purchasing practices in the agri-food sector. There is a very specific recital that addresses this sector. And basically, it recognizes the importance of tackling harmful purchasing practices and price pressures on producers, especially smaller operators. And then there is the very explicit requirement that large food processors and retailers should adapt their purchasing practices and develop and use purchasing policies that contribute to living wages and incomes through their supply chain. So very important tool to leverage. So while those provisions are very welcome, they are really broad, and we see that more guidance is actually needed to ensure that companies develop responsible purchasing practices under the CSDDD. And we see that the Commission's CSDDD guidelines can fill this gap by laying down the appropriate measures to adapt purchasing practices. And we think that this really creates an opportunity for CSOs working on purchasing practices in the agri-food sector. So yes, so next slide, please. And then my last point will be on responsible disengagement under the CSDDD. So the CSDDD addresses responsible disengagement, which is another issue of relevance for producers in the agri-food sectors. However, the Omnibus 1 directive has significantly weakened the original CSDDD framework on responsible disengagement. So, for example, the obligation to terminate business relationships in specific circumstances has been removed. In practice, this means that companies could maintain relationships with partners involved in serious human rights violations, and they could profit from such abuse. Also, important safeguards designed to protect suppliers from irresponsible disengagement have also been removed. So, for example, companies are no longer required to consult stakeholders before deciding to disengage from a very problematic business relationship. So again, the CSDDD guideline consultation is an opportunity for CSOs to advocate for first robust guidance on responsible disengagement, but also share existing international standards and good practices on responsible disengagement. I would like to finish my my presentation by just going back to what Jorge said about the revision of the UTP directive, because we do see that this revision is an opportunity to address the gaps left by Omnibus 1 when it comes to responsible disengagement. And we see that it really has the potential to actually include a new provision of safeguards that protect producers against irresponsible cut-and-run practices. So I think that's something to keep in mind for the future revision, and it's also something to keep in mind in the context of the CSDDD guidelines. Thank you.